You've settled in, haven't you? The soft hum of the engines, perhaps the gentle sway of the car, or just the quiet anticipation in your own space. Now, imagine a different kind of settling in, a moment earned, meticulously carved out of a life that was anything but soft. Because this isn't just a story about a flight, it's a story about the relentless climb, the silent battles fought, and the profound power of simply occupying the space you've undeniably earned. Our journey begins not in the clouds, but decades earlier, on the sun-baked streets of Atlanta. That's where you'd find a young Nia Holloway, not with a silver spoon, but with a fire in her belly and a library card clutched in her hand like a winning lottery ticket. Growing up in a neighborhood where dreams often felt like distant whispers, Nia didn't just dream, she built. Brick by painstaking brick, late night by bleary-eyed morning, she defied every expectation society dared to impose. They said a girl from that side of town, a girl who looked like her, couldn't possibly break through the ivory towers of academia, let alone the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley. But Nia, even then, understood a fundamental truth. Limitations are often just perceptions, and perceptions can be shattered. And shatter them she did. She didn't just graduate from college, she earned her PhD from an Ivy League institution, her brilliance undeniable, her dedication legendary. But education was just the foundation. Nia wasn't content to simply exist within established systems. She was driven to disrupt them. She saw gaps, ignored communities, and unmet needs, particularly in the healthcare sector. That vision, fueled by her own experiences and an unshakable belief in equitable access, blossomed into Oratech Innovations. Oratech wasn't just another tech company, it was a revolution, developing groundbreaking biotech solutions aimed at providing affordable, accessible healthcare to the very communities often left behind. From humble beginnings in a cramped shared office, Oratech had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, a true beacon of perseverance and a testament to Nia's genius and grit. So, when Dr. Nia Holloway boarded her red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle, bound for a landmark partnership meeting, it wasn't a leisure trip. This wasn't a vacation to unwind. This was mission critical. This was the culmination of years of relentless striving, a deal that could quite literally transform healthcare access for millions, changing the landscape for generations to come. The weight of that responsibility, the quiet hum of purpose, settled around her as she navigated the familiar aisle of the first-class cabin. And there it was, seat 1A, plush, spacious, offering a panoramic view of the airport tarmac as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues of orange and pink. For anyone else, it might just be a comfortable seat. But for Dr. Nia Holloway, seat 1A wasn't just a number. It was a destination. A quiet testament to every late night, every closed door, every doubt she'd ever silenced. It was more than a seat. It was a sanctuary carved out of hustle and heart. She exhaled, savoring that fleeting moment of peace, a small luxury she'd allowed herself after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings, a moment earned not by luck, but by relentless hard work and an unyielding spirit. It was the taste of victory before the next battle began. But as Dr. Holloway settled into that well-deserved space, a different kind of hum began to fill the air. Not the soft purr of the engines, but the distinct grating sound of entitlement approaching. The kind of sound that, for so many of us, signals a familiar and unwelcome collision of worlds. The kind of sound that promises to challenge the very peace you've just begun to inhabit. The gentle hum of the airplane engines had just begun to lull Dr. Holloway into a state of contented focus, her mind already shifting to the complex equations of her upcoming meeting. But then, a subtle shift in the cabin's energy registered. It wasn't the usual murmur of settling passengers. It was a ripple of something sharper a distinct presence that seemed to demand immediate attention. From the corner of her eye, Nia observed her. Mrs. Beverly Sterling? Every inch of her screamed curated perfection, from the impeccably coiffed platinum blonde hair to the designer handbag dangling from her arm like a trophy. She moved with an almost regal air, her head tilted just so, as if the very atmosphere of the first-class cabin existed solely to cater to her whims. Behind her trailed a slightly shorter companion, a nervous smile fixed on her face, like a shadow perpetually trying to keep up. Then the whispers began. "Can you believe the airline?" "This seat assignment is ridiculous," Mrs. Sterling muttered, her voice dripping with disdain, just loud enough for a few rows to catch. Her companion, a brunette, offered a placating, "I know, Beverly, but maybe it's just a mistake. They'll fix it." Nia felt a familiar prickle of unease. She'd encountered this particular breed of entitlement before, countless times in different boardrooms, different waiting rooms, different moments where her very presence was questioned. The prickle intensified as the two women stopped, not further down the aisle, but right beside Nia's row. Mrs. Sterling's sharp gaze flickered to Nia, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her handbag. It was a look Nia knew well, a mix of surprise, curiosity, and an almost imperceptible flick of judgment. It was the unspoken question that often followed her into spaces like this. "What are you doing here?" It was a look that implied, without a single word, that her belonging was up for negotiation. Nia, however, was a master of unspoken defiance. She returned her attention to the sleek leather briefcase on her lap, unwilling to engage, unwilling to acknowledge the silent challenge. She had dealt with people like Beverly Sterling her entire life. People who saw her skin color before her accomplishments, who assumed her place in the world was somehow less legitimate, less earned. "Excuse me," Mrs. Sterling's voice cut through the cabin, clipped and imperious. Nia slowly looked up, meeting Mrs. Sterling's gaze squarely. Her own voice, calm and measured, was a stark contrast. "Yes." "I believe there's been a mistake," Mrs. Sterling declared, gesturing vaguely toward Nia's seat. "This is obviously meant for someone else." Nia's eyebrow arched, a subtle gesture of incredulity. "This is my seat, 1A. I reserved it weeks ago." A forced smile, brittle and cold, stretched across Mrs. Sterling's lips. "You see, I'm a Platinum Elite member with this airline. I always get priority seating. You might be more comfortable elsewhere." The audacity of it hung in the air, thick and unwelcome. For a moment, Nia simply stared, letting the weight of the woman's casual entitlement sink in. More comfortable elsewhere. The thinly veiled insinuation was unmistakable. It wasn't about comfort, it was about perceived hierarchy, about who should be where. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you," Nia replied, her voice even, unyielding. Mrs. Sterling's forced smile vanished. Her companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to evaporate. But before Mrs. Sterling could retort, a flight attendant, Gary, appeared, his crisp uniform adding an air of authority he didn't quite possess in that moment. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his gaze darting nervously between the two women. "Yes, there is," Mrs. Sterling announced, her voice taking on a dramatic lilt. "This seat, my seat, has been mistakenly assigned to someone else. I need it resolved immediately." Gary glanced at Nia, who offered a calm but pointed response. "There's no mistake. This is my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it." Gary hesitated, caught between Mrs. Sterling's assertiveness and Nia's quiet confidence. "Let me check your ticket again, ma'am," he said to Nia, his tone polite, but faintly skeptical. Nia handed over her boarding pass without a word, her heart steady despite the growing tension. She had been here before, in boardrooms, on stages, in countless subtle confrontations where she had to prove she belonged. This was just another test. Jerry examined the ticket, then nodded. This is indeed your seat, Dr. Holloway. Mrs. Sterling's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, her polished veneer cracked. That can't be right. She must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they? Nia bit back a sharp retort. Instead, she fixed Mrs. Sterling with a steady gaze. I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over. Mrs. Sterling's companion tugged at her arm, whispering something inaudible, but Mrs. Sterling wasn't ready to let it go. I'm not sure you understand who I am, she said, her voice low but seething. I always fly first class. I'm not about to let someone like... Her friend hissed, cutting her off. Gary cleared his throat, his face flushing. I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you have any further concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor. Mrs. Sterling glared at him, her frustration barely contained. Finally, with a huff, she stormed toward the front of the cabin, dragging her reluctant companion behind her. Gary gave Nia an apologetic look before retreating to handle other duties. Nia watched them go, her expression unreadable. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their curiosity heavy in the air. It wasn't the first time she had been singled out in such a way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But Nia wasn't about to let anyone diminish her. Not today. Not ever. She leaned back in her seat, took a slow sip of sparkling water, and closed her eyes. This was far from over, and deep down she knew it. The calm was deceptive. This kind of storm, born of entitlement and prejudice, often only truly begins when the initial confrontation ends. And Dr. Nia Holloway was about to show them exactly what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for weakness. The brief reprieve was just that, brief. Maya leaned back in her seat, flipping through the pages of a sleek leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. Her meticulous handwriting filled the pages. Notes, strategies, ideas for the monumental deal she was set to close overseas. As she adjusted her reading glasses, a faint commotion caught her attention near the entrance of the first-class cabin. The door had just opened to allow the remaining passengers to board, and sweeping into the cabin, flanked by her companion, was Mrs. Sterling once more. Mrs. Sterling moved with an air of heightened entitlement now, her head tilted high, as if the very air she breathed demanded respect. She paused in the aisle, her sharp gaze scanning the rows like a hawk searching for prey. Maya caught the subtle narrowing of the woman's eyes as they landed on her. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered that look. A mix of curiosity and judgment, laced with the unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" "Excuse me," Mrs. Sterling said sharply, waving at a passing flight attendant. Her voice was cultured, but carried a distinct edge of impatience. "This must be a mistake. My seat is supposed to be here." The flight attendant, Gary, a young man with neatly combed hair and a slightly nervous demeanor, smiled politely. "What seat number, ma'am?" 1A, of course. I always book 1A, she replied, her tone dismissive. She gestured vaguely toward Maya. Her manicured finger pointed like an accusation. "But clearly, there's been a mix-up." Maya's heart sank. She knew where this was going before it even began. Gary checked his tablet and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but 1A is correctly assigned. Dr. Holloway here booked it in advance." Mrs. Sterling's jaw tightened. "And what am I supposed to do about that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a loyal customer of this airline, a very loyal customer. Surely there's some accommodation you can make." Gary shifted uncomfortably. "We can try to arrange something, but—" "There's nothing to arrange," Maya interrupted, her voice calm but firm. She looked up, meeting Mrs. Sterling's gaze squarely. "This is my seat, and I intend to keep it." Mrs. Sterling blinked, as if startled that Maya had spoken. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in another seat, perhaps in business class." The words hung in the air, loaded with implication. Maya's expression didn't waver. She had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with people who underestimated her, who assumed her capabilities based on their own narrow perceptions. This moment was no different. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am," she said evenly. The air around them seemed to shift, the quiet tension of the first-class cabin turning sharp. Other passengers pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their tablets and books. But Maya felt their curiosity, their silent judgment like a weight pressing on her. "Let me handle this," Gary said quickly, trying to de-escalate the situation. He turned to Maya, his voice polite, but carrying an undertone that grated on her nerves. "Dr. Holloway, would you mind moving to another seat? Perhaps 2C? It's still in first class, and it would allow us to accommodate Mrs. Sterling." So that was her name, Mrs. Beverly Sterling. The kind of name that came with country clubs and generational wealth, Maya thought. Maya leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. "I booked this seat for a reason," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I won't be moving." Mrs. Sterling's face darkened. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Maya to hear. She turned to Gary. "Do you even know who I am? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I don't think this is how you want to treat one of your most loyal customers." Gary swallowed, glancing between Mrs. Sterling and Maya. His hesitation said everything. He knew Mrs. Sterling had connections, and yet he also knew Maya was within her rights. But in this unspoken power dynamic, Maya could already feel where his loyalty lay. "I'll get the supervisor," he said at last, retreating down the aisle. Mrs. Sterling turned back to Maya, her lips curling into a forced smile. "You could have avoided all this, you know," she said, her tone saccharine and insincere. "But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise." Maya tilted her head, studying the woman before her. "Compromise," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Interesting choice of words." Mrs. Sterling's smile faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but the arrival of the flight supervisor cut her off. Deborah Lane, a middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and an air of authority, approached, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. "Is there a problem here?" Deborah asked, glancing between Maya and Mrs. Sterling. Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Sterling jumped in. "Yes, there's a problem. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow she ended up here." Deborah's gaze landed on Maya, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Dr. Holloway, would you be willing to move to another seat just to resolve this quickly?" Maya's fingers tightened around the armrest. She looked at Deborah, then at Mrs. Sterling, and then at the other passengers, who were still pretending not to listen. She could feel their silent expectations, the unspoken demand for her to be reasonable, to yield for the sake of keeping the peace. "No," she said simply. Mrs. Sterling let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable," she repeated, shaking her head. "You're really going to make a scene over this? Fine, let's see how far this gets you." Maya smiled faintly, though her eyes remained steely. "Let's." She reached for her phone and began typing a message, her calm demeanor never wavering as the tension around her grew thicker. She had dealt with people like Mrs. Sterling before, and she knew exactly how to handle them. Deborah Lane shifted uncomfortably on her polished black heels, the weight of the escalating tension pressing down on her. As a seasoned airline professional, Deborah had dealt with her share of difficult passengers, but something about this situation felt different. She could sense that Mrs. Sterling wasn't just another disgruntled traveler. She was the kind of customer who believed she deserved preferential treatment simply because she existed. Deborah turned her attention to Maya, who remained seated with an air of calm authority. There was something unshakable about her, a quiet power that seemed to command the space without her needing to raise her voice. Deborah hesitated. "Dr. Holloway," she began cautiously, keeping her tone neutral. "I understand your position, but for the sake of resolving this quickly, would you reconsider moving to another seat? It's still in first class, and—" "No," Maya interrupted, her tone firm but devoid of anger. She didn't even look up from her phone, where she was still typing out a message. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Deborah's lips pressed into a thin line, Her eyes flickered to Mrs. Sterling, who was now pacing a small circle in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Mrs. Sterling's face was a mix of indignation and impatience, as though she couldn't fathom why this conversation was taking so long. "Labra!" Mrs. Sterling interjected, her voice dripping with entitlement. "I don't understand why this is even a discussion. She's being unreasonable. I'm a Platinum Elite member. You know what that means, don't you? I've spent more on this airline than she probably makes in a year. I deserve that seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Several passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy glances, though none of them dared to intervene. Maya finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Mrs. Sterling's with startling intensity. "Mrs. Sterling," Maya said slowly, her voice smooth but laced with steel, "your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Mrs. Sterling's cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. "This isn't about the money," she snapped. "It's about respect. People like you... She stopped short, as if realizing she had ventured into dangerous territory. Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. "People like me?" she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even Deborah seemed to shrink under Maya's gaze. Mrs. Sterling hesitated, floundering for words. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her confidence faltering. "I just meant, well, you're clearly not a frequent flyer in first class, and Maya held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop," she said firmly. "You've said enough." The authority in her voice made Mrs. Sterling recoil, but the woman quickly masked her discomfort with a haughty toss of her head. "Fine," Mrs. Sterling said, turning back to Deborah. "Are you going to let her get away with this?" Deborah felt the eyes of the entire cabin on her, the weight of expectation crushing her. She had been trained to de-escalate situations, to prioritize customer satisfaction above all else. But this wasn't an ordinary dispute. She could see that Maya wasn't just another passenger to be placated or dismissed. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that warned Deborah against pushing too far. "I'm afraid Dr. Holloway has the right to remain in her seat," Deborah said at last, her voice carefully measured. "She booked it, and we cannot force her to move." Mrs. Sterling's face twisted in fury. "Unbelievable!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "This is the kind of service I get after all the money I've spent on this airline. I'll be speaking to corporate about this, mark my words." "You do that," Maya said coolly, returning her attention to her phone. But Mrs. Sterling wasn't done. She turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath about entitled people and incompetent staff. Deborah let out a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. A few moments later, Mrs. Sterling returned, flanked by Gary, who looked both confused and alarmed. Mrs. Sterling had clearly decided that reinforcements were necessary to bolster her case. "She refuses to cooperate," Mrs. Sterling announced loudly, gesturing toward Maya as though she were a misbehaving child. "I demand that you do something about this." Gary looked at Maya, then back at Mrs. Sterling, his expression torn. He turned to Deborah, silently asking for guidance. Before Deborah could respond, Maya stood up. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, and the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Maya's movements were deliberate and precise as she reached for her phone and pressed a button. The faint sound of a ringtone filled the air. "I didn't want to do this," Maya said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She glanced at Gary and Deborah, her eyes cold and calculating. "But since you've decided to escalate, I'll escalate too." She turned her back to Mrs. Sterling and spoke into the phone. "Yes, it's Dr. Nia Holloway," she said, her tone professional but edged with irritation. "I'm currently on one of your flights, and I'm having an issue with the staff. No, I'm not looking for compensation. I'm looking for accountability." The color drained from Deborah's face. Gary shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping in front of him. Mrs. Sterling frowned, clearly confused by the sudden turn of events. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. "I'll expect a response before we take off. And if I don't get one, I'll assume this is a systemic issue and take it to the board." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Thank you." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, turning to Deborah. She smiled faintly. "Now," she said, her voice dripping with quiet authority, "let's see how corporate handles this." Deborah swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling fully on her shoulders. She didn't know who Dr. Nia Holloway was exactly, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a battle she wanted to lose. A quiet power had been unleashed, a strategic move that had bypassed the chain of command entirely. The storm wasn't just approaching anymore, it had arrived, and it was about to reveal the true depth of its force. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath in the moments following Maya's decisive phone call. The hum of the engines was the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence. Maya returned to her seat, her expression calm though her eyes carried a quiet fire. She picked up her leather notebook once again, flipping it open with deliberate care, as if the conversation had already been resolved in her favor. Deborah Lane remained standing near the aisle, her usually confident posture faltering. The weight of Maya's last words, "Take it to the board," echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Maya Carter's tone and composure told Deborah that this was no ordinary customer. Her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully. Meanwhile, a world away from the hushed tension of Flight 827, Dr. Holloway's discreet call had ignited a firestorm within the corporate headquarters. Mr. Thompson, the seasoned board member, had received the urgent message, and his reaction was immediate and decisive. He didn't need a detailed explanation. Maya's calm but firm tone, coupled with the mention of systemic issue and the board, was enough. He knew Dr. Nia Holloway wasn't just any passenger. She was the brilliant mind behind Oratech Innovations, a company he had personally championed for a future strategic partnership. He understood the immense value she represented, not just in potential investment, but in the crucial public image of an airline striving for diversity and inclusion. The last thing they needed was a PR nightmare involving a prominent black female CEO being disrespected on their flight. Within minutes, Mr. Thompson's office became a command center. Urgent calls flew between departments. Lena, a sharp junior analyst in corporate relations, was pulled from her late-night shift. Her task: immediately pull up Dr. Holloway's passenger profile, cross-section it with any VIP or strategic partner lists, and comb through the flight manifest for anyone else with elite status in 1A. Lena's quick thinking paid off. She instantly identified the significance of Oratech Innovations and the potential fallout. She saw the gate camera footage of the initial interaction, the subtle glances, the palpable tension. It was clear this wasn't a simple seating mix-up. It was a deeper issue of perception and privilege playing out on their aircraft. The urgency of the situation superseded all standard protocols. Mr. Thompson didn't hesitate. He bypassed several layers of management and escalated the incident directly to the CEO, detailing the potential reputational damage. The CEO, understanding the precarious balance of public trust, immediately authorized an on-the-spot investigation and intervention. This wasn't just about placating a VIP. It was about protecting the company's integrity and preventing a viral crisis. Back on the plane, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an update from corporate headquarters and will be making a brief delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and will provide additional details shortly." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Deborah's stomach dropped. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing. Corporate was already involved. She turned to Gary, her expression grim. "This isn't over," she said softly. Gary said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time he realized that they had profoundly underestimated Dr. Nia Holloway. The whispers of change from a distant boardroom were now reaching the gate, signaling a reckoning none of them had anticipated. The unseen hand of power had begun to turn the gears, and the storm was about to break.